Alright, so my name is Yarmel, and this is my second video in my two-part video series where we're going over some of the basic terminology you need to know in order to do well in your philosophy class about ethics. Like in my last video, I'm basing this discussion on something called a moral theory primer by Mark Timmons. I'd highly recommend checking that out if you want to get a more nuanced, deep, detailed overview of the theories that I am talking about. So let's just jump right in. Today we're talking about some moral theories themselves. You can see the list of theories we're going to talk about, so I'm not going to waste time reading them. We're just going to jump right in, starting with consequentialism. So consequentialism is a family of moral theories that all say the following thing: an action is right if and only if and because its consequences would be at least as good as the consequences of any alternative action that the agent might instead perform. And I want to highlight two words in this. So the first word I've highlighted is right. Second word I've highlighted is good. Just to kind of review from last time, when we say that an action is right, we're saying that performing that action is obligatory or optional. When we say that its consequences would be at least as good as the consequences of any alternative action, what we're saying is equal in intrinsic value too. Right? So what we're doing is we're taking a look at the consequences and we're wondering how much intrinsic value is in the consequences. So how much good minus how much bad is in the consequences. And then we're picking the one that has the greatest overall balance. Now, let me tell you an example, because I think examples can be really helpful for understanding exactly what consequentialism is all about. So imagine that you work for a large pharmaceutical company and your boss tells you, you know what, this drug we're about to put out in the market, it's going to make us a ton of money, but it's incredibly dangerous. Nobody's going to know that it's that dangerous immediately. It's going to take about like 6 or 7 years before the negative health consequences actually catch up to the users of this drug. But we figured this out through our testing. Luckily, we were able to get a couple of other toxicity and efficacy tests through, and those showed that it's effective. So we're just going to not share this new information and just kind of let it go. Should you blow the whistle? Should you go out and tell the press or the people or call the FDA or something? Like, should you do something to try to, stop this from happening? Well, if you're a consequentialist, what we got to figure out is, first, what's intrinsically good? So there's lots of things that are candidates for what's intrinsically good. One thing that is a candidate is pleasure. Another one is, the satisfaction of preferences. Here I'm going to go with health. So we're just going to assume that health is the intrinsic good. But if we were going to give a full-blown consequentialist theory, part of that would be defending your kind of what the intrinsic good is. We're just going to sort of assume, though, to make sense, to help us, simplify this case, that health is the intrinsic good. All right. So what we do to figure out the right action is to look at what my options are and to figure out which of my options results in the state of affairs with the most amount of good. And if there's a tie, we can do either of them. So my two options are blow the whistle or don't blow the whistle. And in the option where I blow the whistle, we make a little bit more, or we make a little bit less money. Maybe the CEO gets fired, but all these people can avoid this negative health consequence. In the option where I don't blow the whistle, we make a little bit more money in the company, but and the CEO keeps their job, but all these people get really negative health consequences long term. And so blowing the whistle is the option that results in the consequences with the most intrinsic good overall. So if the intrinsic good is health, we're going to look at which option has more health, and we're going to pick that option. And if there's a tie, we can do either of them. And then one question we can ask is, well, what if we just ignore the health of the customers and just think about the money from the corporation, right? Just think about that pesto, that green stuff that this particular CEO is after. And the issue with that is that if you're a consequentialist, you're going to be impartial. So you're not going to be saying, oh, we're just going to look to the good of the people close to us or the individuals of our own species or our own community. We're going to look at the overall good everywhere impartially and pick the pick the action that results in the best consequences overall in terms of this intrinsic good. All right, so that's consequentialism. Let's go on. We're going to talk about something called natural law theory now. So according to natural law theory, we have a theory of the good, we have a theory of the right. The theory of the good is that there are these intrinsically valuable goods. And these are based in human nature. So according to natural law theorists, there are some objective facts about what is good for us given our human nature. And those things are intrinsically valuable. So one list from I believe this was St. Thomas Aquinas, is human life, human procreation, human knowledge, and human sociability. There's other lists that other natural law theorists have given, but I'm going to focus on that one. So that's your theory of the good. Then the theory of the right says that an action is right if and only if and because in performing the action, one does not directly violate any of the intrinsic valuable goods, right? So what we're doing is we're going to look at our actions and we're going to say, can I perform this action? Well, as long as this action doesn't violate any of these intrinsically valuable goods, then I can do it. So let's look at a couple of examples. So consider this example. You're a public school teacher, public biology teacher in Tennessee in the 1920s. And the people in your town strongly object to your teaching Darwin's theory of evolution. In fact, they'd be happier if you would just, claim that the theory is false. So what's intrinsically good? Well, if you go back to our list of intrinsic goods that I put down here, human life was good, human procreation, human knowledge, and human sociability. So let's focus on human knowledge here, right? Let's focus on human knowledge. If you lie and teach these students that, Darwin's theory of evolution is false, you're doing something that violates this intrinsic human good of human knowledge. I mean, Darwin's theory of evolution was one of the greatest achievements ever in terms of understanding the world around us. So to completely lie about that would seem to be a real strong violation of this, of this intrinsically valuable good, right? So according to this natural law theory, you shouldn't do it. But let's consider another example, another more complicated example. It's going to force us to expand upon natural law theory a little bit. Imagine that you're at war, and you're war against like a really kind of vicious opponent who is trying to completely destroy your entire country and kill everybody in it. And you find a munitions factory where they're building weapons, right? And so what you could do is you could bomb that factory. But it just so happens that next to the factory is a house where an innocent family is living. So what do? If you don't blow up the factory, you're violating this intrinsically valuable good of human life because you're allowing all these individuals, like you're going to create you're going to fail to stop this enemy from coming in and killing all of your citizens. So that seems like that's really bad. On the other hand, if you do blow up the factory, you're also violating this other intrinsic valuable good, which is the human life of the individuals inside of this house, right? And so it seems like either way you go, you're doing something to, violate this valuable intrinsic human good. So what do? So let's take another look at the theory of the right for natural law theory. And I've highlighted the word directly. So let's look at that again. An action is right if and only if and because in performing the action, one does not directly violate any of the intrinsically valuable goods. And there's something called the doctrine of double effect. So here's how this goes. An action that would bring about at least one evil effect and at least one good effect is morally permissible if and only if the following conditions are satisfied. So first, intrinsic permissibility. So the action in question, apart from its effects, is morally permissible, right? So consider the case of the bombing. Blowing up a munitions factory in war is something that is morally permissible. So the action we're talking about in question, apart from these effects where you blow up the house, would be permissible. Necessity, it's not possible to bring about the good effect except by performing an action that would bring about the evil effect in question. So in this case, there's really no way that you could get rid of this munitions factory without blowing up the house next door. So that satisfies that. Non-intentionality, the evil effect is not intended. Well, you're not trying to blow up the house. Like, you don't want to do that. It's not that you need to blow up this house in order to blow up the munition factory. It's just kind of a foreseen but unwanted and unintended consequence. And finally, proportionality. The evil that will be brought about by the action is not out of proportion to the good being aimed at. So saving all of your citizens is a lot more good overall than like blowing up this house, right? So the idea here is that you can never directly, you're never supposed to directly violate any of the intrinsic moral goods. But there's some cases where you get these tricky moral dilemmas where no matter what you do, you're going to have to violate some good. There's these conditions for the doctrine of double effect where you're allowed to do it, but it's no longer a direct violation. It's this indirect violation where the evil effect is not intended. It's just kind of it's a foreseen but unintended consequence, right? So that's natural law theory. And what's really important is to note that this is very different than consequentialism, because we're not just weighing the good and the bad. What we're saying is that it doesn't matter how much good or bad is involved, you are absolutely prohibited from directly violating an intrinsically valuable good. But there's some cases where no matter what you do, you're going to have to violate, you're going to have to do an action where the effect involves a violation of some intrinsically valuable good. And then if you just scroll back a minute or two to when I was talking about the doctrine of double effect, you'll see the conditions under which that's permissible. All right, so let's keep it going. Now we're going to talk about Kantian moral theory. So according to Immanuel Kant, there are absolute moral requirements derived from a fundamental principle called the categorical imperative. And so what we're talking about here are maxims. We're talking about these maxims that you can act on. And we're not here talking about pleasure. We're not saying that we're going to, the right action is the one that brings about the greatest pleasure or the greatest health or the greatest overall well-being or whatever else you want to say. What we're saying is that the right action is the action, we figure out what the right action is by looking at these fundamental moral principles and seeing what follows from them. So we're going to look at two. The first one is this formula of universal law. An action is right if and only if one can both A, consistently conceive of everyone adopting and acting on the maxim of one's action, and also B, consistently will that everyone acts on that maxim. So let me give you an example. Let's talk about an example. So imagine that you are a car manufacturer, right? You talk to your customers, about your cars, and you say, hey, these cars are 99% safe, but in conditions X, Y, and Z, they could fail, and then you could die. But you can still buy one if you want, but I just want you to know these are the risks, right? It seems like I could conceive of everybody acting on that maxim, where people, truthfully communicate the risks. And I could consistently will that everybody act on that maxim, right? There's no contradiction when I think about that. I am capable of willing that the world be arranged in such a way that everybody communicates risks accurately when they're selling stuff, right? So that passes the test. But imagine that what I do now is I say, I'm just going to lie to my customers and tell them that the cars are safe, even though they're not safe, right? I sell them cars that are going to break and fall apart and blow up, even if they get into a little fender bender at 10 miles an hour. So now we have to ask is first of all, could I consistently conceive of everyone adopting and acting on that maxim, right? So what's the maxim? Well, the maxim is lie to people lie to people about the safety of your products in order to get them to buy them. If everybody's acting on that maxim, the only way that maxim works is if we all assume that nobody's acting on it, right? And let's break that down a second. Let's break that down a little bit. In order for a lie to be effective, we need to assume that people aren't telling lies. People only believe lies if they assume that people are telling the truth. So the second we universalize that maxim, the second we conceive of everybody adopting that maxim, the maxim itself is undermined because everybody's thinking, okay, I will lie when I think it's going to benefit me. I will lie about the safety of my products to convince people to buy them. So now nobody trusts people's pronouncements about the safety of their products anymore, right? So it fails test A. I can't actually consistently conceive of everybody adopting and acting on the maxim, right? Because the fact that the second that I conceive of everybody adopting the maxim, I can't conceive of everybody acting on it because, once you adopt the maxim, it falls apart. There's an internal contradiction, right? So that's the formula of universal law. Now, let's talk also about another formula of the categorical imperative. So this is called the formula of humanity. An action is right if and only if and because the action treats persons, including oneself, as ends in themselves and not as mere means. So let's take a look at another example. Imagine that I want a sandwich and you have a sandwich. One thing I could do is I could buy it from you. I could say, I'll give you $20 for your sandwich. Better be a good sandwich, $20. But suppose I say, I'll give you $20 for your sandwich. All right? I'm treating you as a means because you are a means of me getting a sandwich, but I'm also treating you as an end in yourself. What I'm doing is I'm saying you are somebody with desires and values and interests, and you're somebody who, for whom the world can go better and worse. You are somebody who can want things and act to accomplish those things. And I'm recognizing that. So when I buy a sandwich for you, I'm recognizing the fact that you value money and that you're going to want to do this trade. And you have the right to not engage in that trade. I'm not forcing you to do the trade. Right? So there what I'm doing is I'm seeing you as an end in yourself and not merely as a means. I'm seeing you as a means, but it's as a means to my sandwich and also as an end. And you can see that I'm respecting you as an ends because I'm offering you money for your sandwich and I'm not forcing you to do the transaction. But now suppose I just want to steal one from you. I just go up and I grab your sandwich, I take it. I don't give you the option of saying no. Now what's happening is I'm seeing you merely as a means to my getting a sandwich, but not as an end in yourself. I'm not respecting you as a person. I'm not seeing you as the sort of person who gets to choose whether or not to engage in the transaction. I'm merely forcing it upon you, right? So that would not satisfy the formula of humanity because formula of humanity says an action is right if and only if and because the action treats persons, including oneself, as ends in themselves and not as mere means. And in this case, I am treating you as a mere means. So let's go on. Rights-based theories. So an action is right if and only if and because in performing it either A, one does not violate the fundamental moral rights of others, or B, in cases where it is not possible to respect all such rights because they are in conflict, one's action is among the best ways to protect the most important rights in the case at hand. Right? So one thing that you can notice is that in this formulation, we didn't tell you what the rights are. And so rights-based theories are a family of theories, just like consequentialist theories are. And in order to have a full-blown rights-based theory, you need to figure out what the rights are. Right? So let's assume, just to help us generate some examples, that you have a right to free speech and a right to life and a right to choose what kind of employment you pursue. So let's talk about a couple of examples. First example, you're a government official. A citizen in your country has criticized some of your policies, so you have them killed, right? Your action was clearly wrong. And as long as we can assume that people have a right to life and to freedom of speech, it's very clear why your action is wrong. You violated their rights. So you performed an action that violated the fundamental moral rights of others. All right? Let's look at another example. There's a war going on against an enemy state that wishes your state's complete annihilation. You don't have sufficient forces enlisted in your military to fight off this enemy forces, as it stands. So what you do is you institute a draft. So what's going on with this draft? Well, the draft does violate the fundamental moral rights of people to, choose their own employment. If military life in this state is anything like the way it is in the hypothetical one that we're talking about now, you're going to have some violations of freedom of speech. And furthermore, you might get the people killed. So you could be violating their right to life as well, depending on how you understand the right to life. So there's a clear violation. But on the other hand, we're talking about the right to life of every single citizen in your country, because we're supposing that this enemy you're fighting against wants to kill all of you, annihilate all of you. So what do? Let's take a look back at the formulation of this rights-based moral theory. So what we see is B, in cases where it is not possible to respect all such rights because they are in conflict, one's action is among the best ways to protect the most important rights in the case at hand. So what's going on here is we're seeing that there's a conflict between these different rights, and we're picking the solution that does the best to protect the most important rights in the case at hand. again, it's important to remember that this is not a consequentialist theory. So we're not just saying, what is good? How do we maximize the good? What we're saying is there's these absolute rights, and, you don't get to violate the fundamental moral rights of others. If you find yourself in a moral dilemma where no matter what you do, you have to violate some rights, then what you do is you try to figure out the best way of protecting the most important rights in the case at hand. But even still, you're not doing a consequentialist theory, because you're not saying, okay, let's just have an impartial assessment of the good and then pick whichever action does the most to do that. Instead, what you're saying is like, in these cases of, try to avoid moral dilemmas, but if you find yourself in one, the goal is to protect the most important rights. And that could be something different than what maximizes the overall good, if what is good is something like health. All right, so let's go on. Now we're going to talk about virtue theories. So when we talk about virtue theories, we're saying an action is right if and only if and because it is what a virtuous agent acting in character would not avoid doing in the circumstances under consideration. So one thing I have to say is that I think that a lot of virtue ethicists wouldn't fully accept this characterization of their theory. We're going to go with it because it's a way of bringing virtue ethics into the framework that is being articulated here. But I just want you to be prepared that if you go and take a class in Aristotle, you're going to get a little bit different framing of what's going on in virtue ethical theories. But I'm just going to, we'll use this here because I think it is actually quite useful for getting a basic understanding of what's going on in virtue ethics. So I'm going to offer a little bit that actually isn't in this text, though. So when we talk about a virtue, we're talking about a habit of thinking and feeling. And in Aristotelian virtue ethics, virtues are these mean states, these sort of middle states between vices of excess and deficiency with respect to a particular domain of acting and feeling. So what does that mean? Let's make this a lot more concrete. Imagine you see a young child beating a dog. And this child is way too small to do any damage to you. You stay away, you don't do anything because you think, you know what, I'm a little bit afraid of this child, like this child is a stick, I'm afraid. Your fear is completely irrational. A child cannot actually hurt you, right? What we would call you is a coward. We call you a coward because you're being deficiently brave. You're being deficiently courageous with respect to this domain of taking actions that, maybe these actions might be a little bit dangerous. In this particular case, you're not doing enough to take risks, right? Take this other one. You see a group of armed men watching a dog fight. You decide to run over, subdue all of them with your bare hands, grab both of the dogs, one in each hand, and run off into the sunset with them and teach them to be nice with one another. There, you're also doing something wrong. What you're doing there is you're way too brazen, like you're way too rash, right? So with respect to this domain of taking actions that might be a little bit dangerous, you're way too excessive. Like you're just going in there. You're not being moderate with respect to that. But what we ought to do is be moderate. What we ought to do is have the right amount of bravery, right amount of courage. So instead of being excessively rash or deficiently cowardly, what you do is you be courageous. So for example, you see somebody beating a dog, you walk over, you convince them to give you the dog, and then you leave. There's other courageous things you could do also. So maybe you call the police. Maybe you distract the person. Maybe you rush over and you stop the person from beating the dog. Like, things are going to depend on your circumstances. If you think that you're physically capable of stopping the beating, go for it. If it's a little bit of a more dangerous situation and you want to call the police to handle that, go for that. Right? So it's going to depend on your circumstances. What a virtuous person will do, what a brave person will do, is going to depend on the circumstances. But the point is that if we're virtue ethicists, what we're doing, we're trying to figure out what we ought to do, is think about what a virtuous person would do. Where a virtuous person is somebody who isn't excessive or deficient with respect to the domain that we're talking about. For example, courage, honesty. What else? Magnanimousness. There's all sorts of domains. and the person acts sort of, act virtuously rather than excessively or deficiently. And just to, since I mentioned these other things, when it comes to like telling the truth, maybe you don't want to be excessive and just tell the full truth and the whole truth all the time, no matter what the consequences are. But you also don't want to be a liar who goes around never telling the truth and always lying, right? You want to find this virtuous middle where you are judicious with respect to when you tell the truth. For when it comes to accepting honors and awards, you want to be proud of your accomplishments. But you don't want to be so proud that you're going around being vain and bragging all the time. You also don't want to be, have false modesty where you pretend that you haven't accomplished anything. You got to have this sort of virtuous middle where you say, yes, I did these things, I'm proud of this, but I'm not going to go around and be arrogant about it. And I'm also not going to hide and pretend I didn't do them, right? So that's virtue ethics. Now, there's one more theory that we're going to talk about, and it's this ethical theory of prima facie duties. So a prima facie duty is a duty that can be outweighed by another duty. And according to W.D. Ross, Sir William David Ross, you have 7 prima facie duties. Justice, so you have to ensure that pleasure is distributed according to merit, right? So the people who feel the pleasure or get the rewards should be the ones who deserve them. Beneficence, one ought to increase the welfare, virtue, or knowledge of others. Self-improvement, you ought to improve your own welfare, your virtue, or your knowledge. Non-maleficence, don't go around harming others. Fidelity, keep your promises. Reparation, if you hurt somebody, you should make amends for those wrongs to them. Gratitude, and you should show gratitude towards your benefactors. So to understand this more, let's look at a case. And what I'm going to do when I'm looking at this case is explain both the prima facie part and how these duties actually function. So imagine that you've promised your boss that you're going to deliver a document to somebody by the end of the business day. On your way there, you come across somebody bleeding out on the street. And suppose you have first aid experience. You worked as an EMT before you got into the corporate world. So what you do is you go over, you administer first aid, and you save this person's life. Now, the thing is, you've just violated a duty. And if you look at this list, what you can see is that you violated a duty of fidelity. You promised your boss that you would deliver the documents, and you didn't do it. But you had another duty that you were following. This was this duty of beneficence. You were increasing the welfare of somebody who really needed it. This person was going to die if you didn't go out and save them, right? And so in this case, you had a duty. You have this prima facie duty of fidelity, like, all the things equal, you should tell the truth. But when it conflicts with saving somebody's life by administering like vital first aid, administer the first aid, right? And that's sort of the thinking behind Ross's approach, where there are all these prima facie duties that you have an obligation to follow. But there's some cases where some duties are going to outweigh each other, and you're going to have to use your judgment to figure out what to do in those cases. All right. So imagine another example. Imagine that, you're in there's a family jewelry business. Maybe your family produces emeralds, and they do all these beautiful jewelry settings, and you've trained in that a little bit, but you really don't want to do that for your whole life. You want to go out, you want to design apps and study philosophy and live like a really exciting life, not doing the family jewelry business. And so what you do is you have a conflict now between a duty of gratitude and a duty of self-improvement. So let's look back at these duties. Duty of gratitude. Prima facie, one ought to show gratitude towards one's benefactors. Your parents are your benefactors. You've benefited from their care. So that's a duty there. But also you have this duty of self-improvement. Maybe the path to self-improvement for you is going to involve studying philosophy so that you can develop more knowledge. You can subject your understanding of virtues to scrutiny. Maybe you're going to be happier there. Maybe that's going to impact your welfare, right? So you have this conflict, and you have to figure out what to do. And in a lot of these situations, it's going to be really clear what to do. In that case, I think that we might need some more details to figure it out. So you might want to ask, how much do you hate the family business? What's the philosophy market like? Is there a way of combining these things so that you're able to do everything, right? So we need to sort of do a little bit more of an in-depth exploration to figure out what you're supposed to do in that context. I'm not going to tell you like here's what the right answer is, but I think what's important is that we've set up the problem. We set up the problem as one of conflicting prima facie duties. All right. So that's all I have. That was part 2 of my 2-part series where we're going to be going over the sort of the basic elements of moral theory, based on a moral theory primer by Mark Timmons. I hope this was helpful. This was all just one take. I didn't do any editing, so this was as if you were at a live lecture. All right, so I hope that you have a fantastic day, and thank you.